will say though is
sorry.
okay. What I will say though is that Anna and I are authors of this book, The Secure Board, and we would be more than happy to gift copies to any of you who are on the call today. If you would like to read it, it's only 100 pages. It's not War and Peace, but we would love to get our message out to as many people as we can. And so if you'd like a copy, please make contact afterwards.
So on the chat, if you say write Secure Board in the chat, and I'll make sure that Claire and Anna will send you that book. So if you really want that now, just write Secure Board.
Thank you. So I thought I might kick off talking about 3 sort of scene-setting things that have been happening in the news over the last couple of weeks, and really sort of pertinent to what's going on in cybersecurity at the moment. And the first one is to think about the fact that here in Australia, over the last probably 3 years, we've seen a huge rise in the number of cyber incidents that are in the press. I think we need to recognise that cyber incidents have been going on for a very long time, but we're seeing much more evolve in the media and commentary, and you can't open the AFR or the internet at the moment without seeing news about an incident or a cyber attack that's happening on well-known organisations. And the Australian Cybersecurity Centre tells us they're seeing a report about every 7 minutes, which is about 70,000 last financial year. And to give you some context, in the US, so we're seeing it every 7 minutes. In the US, they're seeing a cyber attack being reported every 11 seconds. So we're about a decade behind them in terms of what we're seeing, what we're reporting. They are very much in the States and in the UK, for that matter, seeing a much more prolific amount of incidents and also reporting. So if we think about how many reports are occurring now, that's only going to lift if you are following the press around the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. That was enacted back in April, and there was a 3-month sort of hiatus or period of grace period for organisations in critical infrastructure, and that grace period ended last Friday. And now, if you are the owner or the operator of critical infrastructure in Australia, you have to report a significant cyber breach within 12 hours. A lot of organisations within those first 12 hours would be running around trying to work out why things aren't working or what the incident might look like. And unless you have a ransom note right in front of you, you're not necessarily always sure within those first 12 hours exactly what's happening. So that's a pretty short period of time. And as of last Friday now, that's really the way of the future for critical infrastructure in Australia. If you have a less significant incident, you've got 72 hours to report it. So it'll be interesting to see how the Australian Cybersecurity Centre's statistics go up over the next financial year, because now that this mandatory reporting has come in, are we going to see more incidents? Are we going to see a rise in that? And certainly from the business perspective, they need to start to understand what does that reporting look like, and how will the Australian Cybersecurity Centre help them or support them once they're in the face of a crisis like that. So that's a big change that's happened this week, and I think we will continue to see regulatory change occur over the coming weeks and months and years as we keep pace with other countries. And where America is at the moment is they are also bringing in critical infrastructure laws, but from a director perspective, they're starting to look at what is needed on boards around cybersecurity, and starting to look at talent matrices. So really looking down into who's on our board, what skills and capabilities do we have, and what are we lacking? And from a cyber perspective, doing a course or reading a book or attending a webinar is no longer enough. They're really starting to look at what's your history of cybersecurity in your career, in the same way that to manage the financials on a board, you need to potentially have a long history of understanding balance sheets and profit and loss and performance and solvency. So cyber in the States is becoming much more part of the talent matrix of a board. And I think in time, if those laws go through in the States, we're going to start to see that here in Australia. The second thing I wanted to talk about is a type of cybercrime called business email compromise. All we hear about in the press is ransomware, and for a very good reason, and that is that it's costing organisations a lot of money, it's putting a lot of pressure on, it impacts operations, and it's starting to impact the community as well. And there's lots of incidents out there like the Colonial Pipeline, JBS Meats, that are having community impact. 9 News, when they couldn't report the news or print newspapers, the community is starting to be impacted by cyber. So where we see ransomware is very important, but what we're learning from incident responders and breach coaches is that about 40% of incidents are ransomware, but business email compromise is also about 40% of the work that goes through the incident response companies. Business email compromise very basically is where the cyber criminals will put together a plan to target a particular organisation or a particular person. They will overtake that email account in whatever way they can. They'll use phishing, they'll ring people and ask for passwords, they'll do what they can to get into that email account, and then they'll send fraudulent invoices that ask for money to be paid to criminal bank accounts. It is absolutely becoming prolific. It's targeting people who are not celebrities, but might have stature within the community. So they might be CEOs, or they might be board members, or they might be people who are in the public eye. And there's a sense of urgency about them. Please pay this invoice quickly, or please quickly transfer this money. And what we saw this week was a man in Sydney was actually arrested for business email compromise, and only $177,000, which doesn't seem like that much money. But in the scheme of things, if he's getting that money from lots of small businesses, it can have a very significant impact on smaller organisations. So great to see an arrest last Friday morning, I think it was, in Sydney, and he had been defrauding one of the bigger telcos. So really good to see that we're putting that in the press as well, that maybe as a deterrent for people who might think that it's a good way to make money. We're now absolutely seeing that the police are catching up, and hopefully the judiciary does as well, in terms of the penalties that are given to people like this. And the third thing I want to talk about before I hand over to Anna is within this year, we have seen a significant court case where ASIC took RI Advice to court in a civil suit. So what we saw was RI Advice was found guilty of really negligence around their Australian Financial Services licence. Over a 6-year period, they had seen numerous cyber attacks. They really had a culture of complacency when it came to resolving the cyber incidents. And the fact that they went undetected for a long period of time was not really brought up in the case, because once an organisation has an awareness that they have gaps, it really is a race, I think, to be resolving those. 9 incidents they had over 6 years. It's pretty significant. And when the justice handed down the sentence, which was about $750,000 in penalties, they really spoke to the fact that this won't be the first of these cases, and that organisations should certainly see this as setting a precedent. The organisation, RI Advice, admitted that they had done the wrong thing, but I thought it was interesting that the court only gave them 90 days to set a plan and really start to change their ways, which is not a significant amount of time when you think about what they've been through, and probably what they will continue to go through in terms of their reputational damage, trying to get their business to continue running while setting a plan in place in just 3 months to implement cybersecurity changes is pretty significant. They were very lucky that this settled out of court, and that the judge gave them the penalties that they did, because if it had have gone to court, it could have been far more significant. ASIC have now released a guidance note. So if you go onto the ASIC website, you can see that they have, in response to this particular case, they've gone ahead and given some much more up-to-date guidance notes around cybersecurity. So that might be of interest if you wanted to take a look at that. So there are 3 sort of pretty significant things that are going on in the cyber security forum at the moment. The RI Advice case, Google it. It's very, very fascinating, and it won't be the first. The second is business email compromise, and that we can't ignore that. We can't just focus on ransomware, because business email compromise is just as significant. And then the third area is this uprise we're seeing in regulation and governance required around new laws, and the requirement, especially for critical infrastructure, the 11 industries listed in that Act will now be looking to much more rapid mandatory reporting. Anna, over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Claire. As I said before, good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm in Melbourne. It's 6 degrees. It's freezing. So I'm sitting here with my heater on and hoping it will warm up quickly. We thought that before we get into, I suppose, 2 key areas on our agenda today is really just to talk through some definitions. There's a lot of confusion around cyber and what's actually the scope of cyber, and more broadly, what is the accountability of the CIO, the Chief Information Officer. And that was my last executive role at UniSuper, so that's where Michelle and I crossed paths. And often either in the boardroom or with your internal auditors or even with the CEO, often accountability is seen to sit with the CIO when it actually doesn't. And we just thought we'd cover off some of these definitions today to help you all in your roles understand who's accountable for what, but also the roles that other areas play in helping keeping an organisation safe. And the first one is financial crime. Financial crime is actually when someone pretends to be someone that they're not, and usually interrupts the manual processes that we have in place in organisations to do certain things. And to help bring this to life, I thought I'd share 2 examples with you. When I worked at UniSuper, on multiple occasions, we would have hackers, but they're not cyber hackers, but hackers actually be very patient and take a series of actions to actually try and steal money from UniSuper members. And one example of how they might do that is we had one person ring up our contact centre and actually change their email address. Now, that's not unusual, and we do that through the contact centre, so it can be done through the digital platform, but many members like to do that over the phone. They then sat there patiently and waited another 4 to 6 weeks and then changed their password. Now, remembering they're pretending to be a UniSuper member. They then actually put through a transaction to withdraw $1 million from the member's superannuation account. Now, we're extremely fortunate that UniSuper had a financial crime team that picked up on this behaviour, and what they noticed was it was going to an account with a different BSB to what the member actually had registered with UniSuper, and we use data and AI to actually help identify that. But that's a good example. And another one is the board that I sit on. As board members, we don't have access to the HR or payroll system to change our bank account details. So someone actually pretended to be a board member and contacted the HR team and changed the bank account details of a board member and had their board salary, their board pay actually directed to a different account. Now, what I find a little bit funny is it took about 6 months for the board member to notice. Now, the second area for definition is around data governance. Now, data governance is actually around who owns the data across the business. Now, often when we hear data, straight away we think IT owns it. IT is actually the custodian of the data, but the business owners or business executives own the data and the quality of data. Now, our good friend, Dr. Catherine Lopez, she's a data scientist, actually uses an analogy that I'm going to share with you today, and it's got to do with water. She talks about when it rains, we capture the water, it runs down the mountains and into the hills and into the reservoirs. Now, IT's role, if we use that analogy with water, IT's role in data is to actually make sure that the pipes are good quality and that the water is going to where it needs to go to. The business owners in this case actually own the quality of the water and making sure that the water is being used appropriately. So that's a quick summary of those 2 definitions. I'm going to pass to Claire for 2 more.
Thanks, Anna. So I wanted to cover 2 definitions as well. And one is something I think people get very confused about, and that is the difference between being compliant and being secure. So the challenge, I think, is that many organisations are regulated in some way, shape or form, whether it's ASIC or APRA or critical infrastructure or even just the Privacy Act. And compliance is actually applying the cybersecurity controls that might require you to meet law or a regulation or a third-party contract. Cybersecurity is actually putting the controls in place. So having controls, the systems that you have that prevent the unauthorized access. So if you think about the fact that compliance is the process or the meeting of particular obligations, but the cybersecurity controls are actually what stops the unauthorized access. So you can have as many policies as you want, but you tick a box and say, yes, we've got these structures in place or these frameworks. But really what you need is to show that your controls are in place and that they're effective. And often compliance obligations don't look at effectiveness. They just look at whether or not you have particular things in place. So for boards, Anna and I are often talking about not just the focus on the compliance, but also the focus on, are we securing our organisation and protecting ourselves from particular risk? Compliance is also can be very generic because it's trying to cover a large group of organisations or a whole industry, whereas cybersecurity is very specific to your organisation's maturity, your risk appetite, your risk posture, whether or not you've been through an incident in the past, whether or not you are a sole operator or you have many third parties. There is so much complexity to cybersecurity that doesn't necessarily come into play when we're thinking about compliance. So a really, really good definition to think through is, are we just compliant or are we actually secure? And the other one I wanted to talk about was incident response. And what some people don't realise when we define incident response is that incident response actually starts with preparation. So Anna and I were on a panel with the chair of Toll last year, I think. And one of the key things that he said on that panel was, I just wish we had been more prepared. And, they had a number of cyber incidents in close succession, and preparation is the very beginning of incident response. And I know that probably seems a bit odd because you're being proactive about an incident, but it really is thinking through some of those clear questions around who would make decisions during an incident. Would we pay a ransom if we were faced with that question? Do we have cyber insurance, and when would we call the insurer? Having all of those questions and answers ready to go is part of your incident response, but it actually happens well before an incident ever occurs. You then have the detection phase, where you might have an alerting system that tells you that something's not quite right. You might have a customer ring you and tell you that they can't access their account. Your website might go down, your payment systems might go down. So that's detection. You then analyse what's happening. You might use a third party to help you, or you might have the skills inside your organisation. You then want to contain and eradicate whatever that incident is. Then you recover from it. And then just as important as your preparation is your post-incident review, really trying to understand, how did this all happen and how do we prevent it from happening again? So incident response starts with preparation and ends with preparation, because once you go through that whole process and you mop everything up, you need to prepare so that you're not impacted by this in the future. Anna, back to you.
Terrific. Often, I suppose over the last decade or so, cyber has been seen as the accountability of the IT team. And something that Claire and I really advocate for, and what is the centre of our book, so when you get your copies, it will come home and land with you, is that cyber is actually an enterprise risk. It's no longer a problem that IT can solve on their own. And what I thought I'd share with you today is some hidden risks when it comes to cyber. And I'm hoping that in your role as board directors, CEOs and other business leaders, that this actually helps create a broader understanding of cyber risk, and also really just the way that we operate day to day, the areas that we need to really consider to help keep the organisation safe. So the first hidden risk is actually our culture. Now, as a board director and previous executive, culture is a really challenging thing to change, and it's also a very challenging thing to measure. And when it comes to cybersecurity, it plays such a critical role in keeping the organisation safe. Claire's just talked to you about email compromise. That is really, I suppose, highlights the need for our employees to actually be more mindful in how they're keeping the organisation safe. And when I was running IT at UniSuper, it often felt like we had a cyber strategy and we were implementing technology controls to keep the organisation safe. But unless the employees actually understood their role in keeping the company safe, often I felt like I was doing things I describe it as plugging holes, mitigating risks, but the business was actually unintentionally opening holes up or opening risks up unintentionally. So it's really, I suppose, to help share the understanding that culture plays such an important role, with over 90% of cyber events in the last 12 months actually being caused by human error. So thinking about the role that we all play around culture. So if we're a board director, we're accountable for culture. We actually delegate that accountability to the CEO on a day-to-day basis in terms of how they choose to run the company. And also, I suppose, what they talk about with culture, what you walk past is what you accept. So the CEO actually, I suppose, runs that and does that for the board on a day-to-day basis. But a really good example is actually a 2017 breach of Equifax, which is a UX credit reporting firm. Now, what was actually found through this, after the sensitive information of 148 million consumers across the US, Canada, and the UK was actually exposed. So there were things like dates of birth, social security numbers, private addresses, gender, phone numbers, driver's license numbers, everything that I suppose you would need 100 points of ID to actually then pretend to be someone else. But it was actually found that this breach could have been avoided. So it was found that there was a culture of cybersecurity complacency, as well as a lot of, I suppose, an underinvestment in IT, and they had a lot of old IT legacy systems. So as a CEO or as a board, it's important to think about how you're helping drive a cybersecurity culture. So how, as a board, are we doing that? By setting the CEO's performance KPIs. And then also as a CEO, how are we actually doing that across driving the right behaviours across the executive team and not just with the CIO. So Equifax actually spent 1.4 billion recovering from the cyber attack. They basically turned over the entire executive. They have a new CEO and a new executive team, and all of those people now have cyber as part of their performance plans. The key takeaway there is really just to think about our role as board directors and CEOs, and I suppose the influence that we can have in helping create and foster that cybersecurity culture. The second hidden risk is around activities of mergers and acquisitions. And for most organisations today, it's these activities that are part of most growth strategies, but they do actually contribute to a significant amount of cyber risk. Now, even just from an IT perspective, what I've found over the past few decades is that often IT was not seen as an important part of due diligence. Often it was seen as something that could be done after the deal had been signed. So what we've found is that two organisations we can learn from is that that's not right, and often that can actually get you in hot water, and it should definitely be something that's considered about the organisation before an acquisition is done. And a really good example is Marriott Hotels. Now, we've all heard of the Marriott Hotels. They acquired a company called Starwood Hotels, who had experienced a breach of their room booking system. Now, the breach actually took place before the acquisition. But what I just wanted to check, and I'm going to ask you to pop this in your chat, is just how much you think the breach actually cost Marriott Hotels. And while you're thinking about that, just to put some size around it, it impacted 339 million customers globally. And it shared things like their names, addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, passport numbers, and credit card details. How much do you think that might have cost Marriott Hotels? And as I start to see them pop up in the chat, I'll tell you whether we need to go higher or lower. Okay, 50 million, 400 million, we're going higher. 1 billion. 10 billion, you're getting there? Yep, 10 billion. Okay, I'll just pause there because I could do this all day. It's actually 24 billion. And if you think that Marriott acquired Starwood Hotels, obviously to grow their business, this has obviously had a significant impact on, I suppose, what this strategic intent was of the deal. And I'm just going to share with you briefly what the costs were, because Claire talked a little bit before about ransom. Now, most people assume the costs associated with a cyber breach are actually the ransom payment, but I'm going to demonstrate through the Marriott example that this is actually not the case. $30 million was spent in recovery. That's actually the lowest investment out of the 4 areas that contributed to the $24 billion. The second is that they were fined due to the data breach by the UK's Information Commissioner's Office. So they fined them $120 million. The criticism that Marriott Hotels actually had due to the inadequate cybersecurity controls they had in place saw the share price drop by almost 5% immediately after the details of the breach were released. In addition, the company estimates that they lost $1 billion in lost revenue due to the loss of customer loyalty and trust. And the last one, and this is the one Claire talked before about how we're always the slow followers to the US. What we're actually seeing globally now is customer class actions. If you want to read a bit more about that, read about T-Mobile. There's some others that are going on. This other one with Marriott's a good example as well. But there's multiple class action lawsuits underway for failing to keep customer information safe. Now, in North America alone, a class action is requesting $12.5 billion in damages. It's astounding. The second one is one that Claire mentioned to you before, and it's an example that's closer to home, and that's RI Advice. Now, RI Advice experienced their cyber events between 2016 and 2000, which is actually prior to IOOF acquiring them. So once again, we can only assume, because it hasn't been said publicly, but we can assume that IOOF did not do adequate due diligence around cyber when they were actually looking at doing the RI Advice acquisition. But it was actually IOOF's name that was also through the media, as it was found through ASIC, that they had failed to meet the Corporations Act, and they did get a $750,000 fine for that. So the key takeaway here is really when we're looking at growing our business, thinking about the business that we're looking to partner with or acquire, but also it's considering that the growth aspirations you're seeking to achieve, if you don't do your due diligence properly, it can actually have a significant impact on reputation, financial loss, and your relationship with the regulators. The third and final hidden risk is actually third-party relationships. Now, we're seeing this play out a lot in the media at the moment, both locally and globally. And as organisations, it's natural that we partner with other organisations to either leverage their expertise or perform a function that we don't want to do or don't have the right resources or skills to do. So when you're partnering with third parties, you're actually giving them access to your data, but your customers actually trust you with that data. They're not actually explicitly trusting that third party with that data that you choose to share with them to perform your business functions. Now, we've seen this come out quite publicly in May this year with NDIS. So Bill Shorten had just taken over as the Minister for NDIS, and they found through a third-party software partner that data had actually been exposed. Now, the sensitive information that was compromised was actually information about disability services, out-of-home care, and very sensitive information about the situations for each of those people that use NDIS. The hackers actually posted a sample of the data on the dark web several days later. And most concerning is that the third-party partner, the software provider, is actually unable to validate or verify what information has been exposed. And also, I suppose, the extent of that. NDIS has been criticised in the media for not being more transparent about the breach and also not taking accountability for the breach. The second example, and I'll keep these brief, I'm mindful of time. You can probably see that Claire and I could talk about cyber all day, is that in 2020, Western Australian Health actually had to suspend the use of a third-party paging service as sensitive information that had been communicated over the service was found on a public-facing website. This is information between doctors or doctor to doctor, discussions about child protection updates. This sort of thing for me just, I suppose, heightens the sensitivity of the risks that we do have in terms of exposing sensitive information from a cybersecurity perspective. And the last one that I'll share with you is a payroll provider called Frontier. Now they use a product called, or they have a product called Chris 21, which is actually quite well known. They experienced a cyber event in November 2021, which resulted in them having to shut their systems down. Now that led to their customers either having to pay payroll, make their employee payroll payments manually, or some organisations were actually unable to make payments to their employees at all. That they were completely dependent on Frontier having to isolate the cyber event and bring their systems back up. So the key takeaway here is really to think about what functions third parties actually manage for your organisation, what data they have access to, and if there was actually a cyber event that, with that third party, it would actually be your organisation that would be in the newspaper and your reputation at risk, not the reputation of the third party. Thanks. I'll pass back to Claire now.
Thanks, Anna. I'll just wrap up. It would be remiss of me not to talk about a little bit more about incident response and really about preparation. And really for most organisations, the best place to start is to have an incident response plan. If you have ever been part of a drill or an incident response exercise or scenario, you would know that 99% of the time, you're not going to follow the incident response plan to the letter because every incident is different. However, having that document brings people together to write the document. It brings the right people together to update the document. It brings incident response and cybersecurity to the attention of people in your organisation who you might want to put their contact details in the document. It really is a document that is living and breathing like most other policies in your organisation, because people move on, people change, you get more new third parties, and you have to keep the document up to date. So having someone in your business who's responsible for the incident response plan and keeping it current is incredibly important, because if your head of IT is away or whoever is responsible in the face of a cyber crisis isn't there, that document is going to become incredibly important. And print it, have it printed off somewhere on a shelf, because if you can't access your IT systems, you probably can't access the contact details in the document that's somewhere in your SharePoint or in your files, and or have a cheat sheet or something that has those particular people's details on it that doesn't involve you having to get into your computer systems to get that. Incident response, also thinking through the fact that it's not fast. A lot of businesses think you get a ransom demand, you pay the ransom, you get the encryption keys, and you unlock everything. It's actually not that quick. When you look at Colonial Pipeline in the States, they ended up using their own systems to get back up and running because the decryption keys and the process that the criminals gave them was so incredibly slow that they actually got back up and running faster than if they used what the bad guys had given them to unlock their systems. So it is a lot slower than you think. Negotiating with cyber criminals takes a long time, and you can't do it by yourself. And the mop-up of incident response takes a long time. So Toyota, for example, they were nearly 12 months. They had to rebuild all of their technology systems. Toll were almost 12 months. Channel 9 were 9 months. There was a school in New South Wales who I'm going to say was 9 months mopping up. And a lot of organisations are never the same again. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because of the learnings you would take from it. But it really is something to consider, that a cyber incident, if you're prepared, you can contain it. If you're not prepared and it blows out of proportion, then it can take months and months and months to get back up and running, and a lot of manual processes can be involved. And if it starts to impact your ability to serve your customers, or in fact, as Anna mentioned, pay your staff, then it has a flow-on effect for your organisation and your ability to be solvent, which is what Anna and I talk to boards a lot about. I want to finish up with an example that I talked earlier about how cyber is starting to impact the community. Last week, Port Phillip Prison had a cyber attack, and they had to stop allowing visitors into the prison because their whole their whole IT network had to be shut down. So you think about how computers run so much of what we do these days. They couldn't let visitors into the prison. They couldn't even allow Zoom calls or video conferencing rights to their prisoners to even have a video call with people. And so, you know, yes, prisoners are there for a reason, but they need visitors as well, and they need support. And because of a cyber attack, which is still being investigated, they can no longer allow visitors either virtually or in person into their Truganina site. So the scary thing about that is that shutting that down also, obviously, IT systems run a lot of the security in the prison. And so thinking through the community impact, you know, we've seen petrol be cut off in the States, we've seen meat be cut off in here in Australia. Now we're looking at prisons, and if the bad guys can get into the prison systems, that starts to have a whole other level of keeping people awake at night, I think, as a very, very recent example just happening in the last few days. So, Ivan, that is it from Anna and I. We covered a lot in a short period of time, so apologies if that was a bit overwhelming. But
it was like just jam-packed with information. Thank you, Claire.
Yes.